Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers fear to reach and winter claims lives without warning, Jake Morrison limped through 2 feet of fresh snow toward the cabin that would change everything. His grandfather's will had been clear. The property was his, but the sealed back room was never to be opened. Jake's war-shattered legs screamed with each step, a constant reminder of the IED that ended his Army career and left him with nothing but disability checks and nightmares. What his grandfather never knew was that Jake wasn't just any soldier. He was military intelligence, trained to spot lies, decode secrets, and survive when the world turned hostile. As he pried open the rusted padlock with trembling fingers, the musty air revealed something impossible. Dozens of classified documents, photographs of experiments, and a list of names that included every missing person from the surrounding towns since 1948. Someone had been watching the cabin. Fresh tire tracks in the snow proved it. But why guard a secret for 75 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he studied the documents spread across his grandfather's dusty workbench. The papers were yellowed with age, stamped with classifications he recognized from his intelligence days: top secret, eyes only, Project Blue Book. But these weren't the usual UFO reports he'd expected from that program. These were medical files, psychological evaluations, and something called subject conditioning protocols. The photographs made his stomach turn. Black and white images of men, women, and children strapped to tables, electrodes attached to their heads, their eyes vacant and staring. In the margins, someone had written notes in his grandfather's familiar handwriting: Day 15, subject shows complete memory suppression and behavioral modification successful. Release to community authorized. His grandfather hadn't just witnessed these experiments, he'd participated in them. Jake's hands shook as he read through the list of names. Sarah Chen, age 8, disappeared hiking with her family in 1952. Marcus Webb, 34, vanished while hunting in 1961. The Hendricks family, all 5 members, reported missing during a camping trip in 1969. Dozens of names spanning decades, all from the surrounding mountain communities. A loose photograph fell from between 2 documents, landing face up on the concrete floor. Jake bent to retrieve it, wincing as his damaged leg protested. The image showed a group of men in military uniforms standing before what looked like a bunker entrance. In the center, wearing a colonel's insignia, stood a younger version of the grandfather Jake thought he knew. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the bunker, were the missing people. Alive, but changed somehow. Their postures were rigid, unnatural, their expressions blank as mannequins. The sound of an engine cutting through the mountain silence made Jake freeze. He limped to the small window and peered through the grime-covered glass. A black SUV with government plates was winding up the narrow access road, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. They'd been waiting for him to open the room. Jake's military training kicked in, suppressing the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He had minutes, maybe less, before whoever was in that vehicle reached the cabin. His eyes swept the room, taking inventory of potential weapons, escape routes, defensive positions. The cabin's back door led to a steep drop-off into the forest below, treacherous in daylight and potentially fatal at night. But it was his only option. He stuffed as many documents as he could into his jacket, focusing on those that seemed most damning. A folder marked termination protocols caught his eye, and he grabbed it along with the photograph of his grandfather. The rest would have to stay behind, but he'd memorized enough names and dates to know this was bigger than just missing persons cases. The engine sounds grew closer. Through the window, he could see the SUV's lights approaching the final turn before the cabin clearing. Jake made his decision. He moved to his grandfather's old desk and pulled out the bottom drawer completely, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was a .38 revolver, still oiled and ready, along with 2 boxes of ammunition. His grandfather had always been paranoid about government overreach, but Jake was beginning to understand it hadn't been paranoia at all. The SUV doors slammed shut outside. Footsteps crunched through the snow, deliberate and unhurried. They weren't trying to surprise him. They wanted him to know they were coming. Jake checked the revolver's cylinder, confirmed it was loaded, and slipped it into his waistband. He took one last look around the room that had held its secrets for 75 years, then headed for the back door. Whatever his grandfather had been involved in, whatever sins he'd committed or witnessed, the truth was now Jake's burden to bear. As he stepped into the bitter mountain night, one thought echoed through his mind. If they'd killed to protect this secret for 3/4 of a century, they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The morning brought no relief from the weight pressing against Marcus's chest. He'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the old cabins settle around him like arthritic bones. Every creak made him think of his grandfather's weathered hands, of secrets hidden in plain sight. The key felt heavier than it should have as Marcus turned it over in his palm. Brass, worn smooth by decades of handling, with an intricate pattern etched into its head that looked almost military in design. He'd found it taped under the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, exactly where the note said it would be. The note itself had been tucked inside his grandfather's old Bible, written in the familiar spidery handwriting that had addressed birthday cards for 32 years. "Marcus," it had said, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the time for keeping secrets has passed. The key opens what I could never close, room behind the pantry. Trust no one with what you find, not even family, especially not family. Forgive an old man his cowardice. Grandpa Joe." Now, standing before the narrow wooden door he'd somehow missed during yesterday's initial exploration of the cabin, Marcus felt his grandfather's presence like a ghost at his shoulder. The door was tucked behind the kitchen pantry, partially concealed by shadows, and positioned at an angle that made it nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. His prosthetic leg clicked softly against the floorboards as he shifted his weight, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The doctors had told him he was lucky. The IED in Kandahar could have taken both legs, or worse, lucky. He'd stopped believing in luck the day his squad's convoy hit that roadside bomb. The key slid into the lock with a soft whisper of metal on metal. For a moment Marcus hesitated. His grandfather had been the most honest man he'd ever known, a decorated Korean War veteran who'd never told a lie bigger than claiming the fish he'd caught were larger than they actually were. What could Joseph Sullivan have hidden that required such elaborate secrecy? The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been maintained despite years of disuse. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the weak morning light filtering through the cabin's windows. Marcus found a light switch just inside the doorway. The single bulb that flickered to life illuminated a space that was larger than it should have been, extending back under what must have been the cabin's rear addition. The air smelled of old paper and something else, something chemical and sterile that made his nose wrinkle. The room was an archive. File cabinets lined one wall, their metal surfaces pocked with rust but still functional. A desk sat in the center of the space, its surface covered with manila folders, photographs, and documents that looked official enough to make Marcus's stomach clench. Above the desk, photographs and newspaper clippings were pinned to a large corkboard in a pattern that suggested obsession rather than casual interest. Marcus approached the desk slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The photographs were black and white, some clearly military in nature. Groups of soldiers in uniforms he didn't recognize, scientists in white coats standing beside equipment that looked decades out of date, and faces, dozens of faces, some circled in red ink, others connected by lengths of colored string like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. One photograph made him stop breathing entirely. It showed his grandfather as a much younger man, maybe 25, standing beside a man in a lab coat. They were both smiling, but something in his grandfather's eyes looked wrong, haunted. Behind them, partially visible through what appeared to be an observation window, was a room containing several beds. Each bed was occupied. Marcus picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. Someone had written on the back in faded blue ink, Project Lazarus, Day 23, subject responses improving. The manila folders were organized by date, starting in 1953 and ending in 1967. Marcus opened the first one at random and found himself staring at medical charts, psychological evaluations, and progress reports that made his blood run cold. Words jumped out at him: subject deterioration, memory suppression protocols, involuntary participation, extreme measures authorized. A loose document slipped from the folder and drifted to the floor. As Marcus bent to retrieve it, he noticed the letterhead: U.S. Army Medical Research Division, classification level, top secret. The document was signed by someone named Dr. Harrison Webb and countersigned by Staff Sergeant Joseph Sullivan. His grandfather's signature, on papers authorizing medical experiments on unwilling subjects. Marcus sank into the desk chair, the weight of discovery crushing down on him like the collapsed ceiling of a bombed building. Outside, a car engine rumbled to life somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying clearly through the mountain air. Too clearly. The nearest neighbor was supposed to be 5 miles away. He wasn't alone anymore. The morning brought no relief from the previous night's unease. Marcus sat at his grandfather's kitchen table, nursing black coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through old socks. His prosthetic leg ached, phantom pain, the doctors called it, though there was nothing phantom about the discomfort shooting through his residual limb. He'd barely slept. Every creak of the old cabin's settling wood had jerked him awake, his military training making him hyper-aware of sounds that shouldn't be there. 3 times he'd grabbed the Glock from his nightstand, only to find empty darkness beyond the windows. The locked room haunted his thoughts. In daylight it seemed almost mundane, just another door in a house full of dusty memories. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather had hidden it for a reason. The old man had been many things: stubborn, secretive, occasionally cruel. But he'd never been careless. Marcus limped to the hallway and examined the door again. Solid oak, probably original to the 1940s construction. The lock was a heavy-duty deadbolt, newer than the rest of the hardware. Someone had retrofitted this room for security. He ran his fingers along the frame, feeling for loose spots. Nothing. The hinges were on the inside, eliminating that option. He could break it down, but something made him hesitate. Once he crossed that threshold, there would be no going back to ignorance. The sound of tires on gravel outside made him freeze. Marcus moved to the front window, staying clear of the glass as he peered through the curtains. A forest green pickup truck sat in his driveway, government plates barely visible through the dust coating the rear bumper. A woman climbed out. Early 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking boots and a canvas jacket that suggested outdoor work rather than office duty. But her posture screamed federal agent, alert, controlled, scanning the environment even as she walked to his door. Marcus checked his weapon and moved to answer her knock before she could pound again. "Mr. Hayes?" Her smile was professional, not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen, Department of Interior. I was hoping to speak with you about your grandfather's property." "Department of Interior handles parks and wildlife," Marcus said, not moving from the doorway. "This is private land. May I come in? It's regarding some historical documentation that may have been left here." Every instinct Marcus had developed during 2 tours in Afghanistan started screaming. Federal agents didn't make house calls about historical documents. They sent letters, filed paperwork. They definitely didn't drive unmarked trucks to remote cabins with no backup visible. What kind of documentation? Agent Chen's smile faltered slightly. The kind that could be valuable to researchers studying Cold War activities in this region. Your grandfather may have possessed materials related to government operations from the 1950s and 60s. There it was. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. How did she know about his grandfather's potential connection to anything classified? He'd inherited the cabin less than a week ago and hadn't told anyone about the locked room. I'm afraid I haven't found anything like that, he lied smoothly. Just old furniture and family photos. I understand. Would you mind if I took a quick look around? Sometimes these documents are stored in unusual places, attics, basements, hidden compartments. Actually, I would mind. Marcus shifted his weight, making sure she could see the outline of his holstered pistol. I'm still going through my grandfather's belongings. When I'm ready for visitors, I'll let people know. Chen's facade dropped entirely. Her hand moved subtly toward her jacket, a telltale sign she was armed. Mr. Hayes, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This isn't really a request, and I think you should leave my property before I call the sheriff. They stared at each other for a long moment. Marcus had faced down Taliban fighters and corrupt Afghan officials. One middle-aged federal agent, legitimate or otherwise, didn't intimidate him. Of course, Chen said finally, the fake smile returning. I apologize if I overstepped. Here's my card. If you happen to find any government documents, maps, reports, photographs from that era, please give me a call. For security reasons, some material should be returned to proper channels. Marcus took the card without looking at it. I'll keep that in mind. He watched through the window as she drove away, noting that she turned left instead of right at the main road, away from town rather than toward it. Either she wasn't familiar with the area, or she was heading somewhere else entirely. Marcus locked the front door and returned to the hallway. The locked room suddenly felt less like a mystery and more like an urgent priority. He retrieved a crowbar from his grandfather's tool shed. Whatever was behind that door, Agent Chen wanted it badly enough to risk approaching him directly, which meant Marcus needed to find it first. Marcus spent the next 3 hours methodically photographing every document in the steel cabinet, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. The deeper he dug into the files, the more disturbed he became. Project Blackwood wasn't just about mind control experiments. It was a systematic program to create sleeper agents from returning soldiers, men whose war trauma made them perfect candidates for psychological manipulation. The photographs showed clinical settings that looked more like torture chambers than medical facilities. Men strapped to tables, electrodes attached to their heads, their faces contorted in agony. Progress reports detailed how subjects responded to various stimuli, how their personalities could be fractured and rebuilt, how memories could be selectively erased and implanted. But it was the personnel file that made his blood run cold. Dr. Harold Whitmore, project director. The photograph showed a younger version of his grandfather, wearing a crisp white coat and the cold smile of a man who viewed human beings as laboratory specimens. Marcus sank into the chair, staring at the image on his phone screen. Everything he thought he knew about Harold Whitmore crumbled away like ash. The gentle grandfather who had taught him to fish, who had bandaged his scraped knees and told him bedtime stories about brave soldiers, that man had never existed. In his place was a monster who had systematically destroyed the minds of veterans, men who had already sacrificed everything for their country. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a disabled veteran himself, uncovering his grandfather's legacy of torturing other veterans. Had Harold looked at him during those childhood visits and seen another potential subject? Had those seemingly innocent conversations about Marcus's military ambitions been something more sinister? A floorboard creaked somewhere above his head. Marcus froze, his finger hovering over his phone screen. The sound came again, definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone was in the cabin. He quickly pocketed his phone and moved to the steel cabinet, gathering the most damning files. The photographs he couldn't take, but he could grab enough documentation to prove what had happened here. As he stuffed papers into his jacket, another sound made his heart race, the distinctive squeak of the front door opening. The basement had no other exit. He was trapped. Marcus looked around frantically, his military training kicking in despite his panic. The basement had several dark corners where old furniture and storage boxes created natural hiding spots. He chose a shadowy alcove behind a stack of moldy cardboard boxes, squeezing himself into the space just as footsteps, began descending the wooden stairs. The intruder moved with purpose, their steps confident and unhurried. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows, grateful that his dark clothing would help him blend into the gloom. Through a gap between boxes, he could see the basement stairs. A man appeared, middle-aged and wearing an expensive-looking overcoat despite the warm weather. He carried a small flashlight and moved like someone familiar with the space. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he went straight to the steel cabinet without hesitation. "God damn it," the man muttered, seeing the open lock on the floor. His voice carried a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place. "Someone's been here." The intruder began rifling through the cabinet's contents, and Marcus realized with growing dread that this wasn't a random break-in. This man knew exactly what was supposed to be in that cabinet, and he was checking to see what might be missing. After several minutes of searching, the man pulled out a cell phone. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "The Whitmore site has been compromised. Someone accessed the archives." A pause. "No, everything's still here, but the lock was broken. Professional job." Marcus strained to hear the other side of the conversation, but the man was speaking too quietly. What he could make out was enough to confirm his worst fears. There were others involved, and they were actively monitoring his grandfather's property. "I'll sweep the area for any trace evidence," the man continued. "If it's the grandson, we'll need to move to containment protocol." Another pause. "Yes, I understand the stakes. This cannot get out, especially not now." Containment protocol. The phrase sent ice through Marcus's veins. These people weren't just worried about embarrassing revelations, they were prepared to kill to keep Project Blackwood buried. The man ended his call and began a methodical search of the basement, his flashlight beams sweeping across every corner. Marcus held his breath as the light passed inches from his hiding spot, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the intruder headed back upstairs. Marcus waited until he heard the front door close before emerging from his hiding place, his legs cramping from the awkward position. He needed to get out of here immediately. These people knew he existed, knew he might be a threat. But as he started toward the stairs, one thought stopped him cold. If they were willing to kill to protect this secret, how many others had already died? And more importantly, was he next? The photographs scattered across the desk like fallen leaves, each one more disturbing than the last. Marcus's hands trembled as he held them closer to the lantern's flickering light, his prosthetic leg aching from standing too long in the cramped space. The black and white images showed what appeared to be medical procedures, but something was fundamentally wrong with every frame. Children strapped to tables, men in military uniforms observing from the background, clipboard-wielding doctors in white coats, their faces clinical and detached, but it was the subjects themselves that made his stomach lurch, emaciated figures with hollow eyes, some bearing visible deformities, others appearing almost catatonic. He set the photos down with shaking fingers and reached for one of the manila folders. The tab read Subject Group 7 in neat block letters. Inside, handwritten notes detailed what could only be described as human experimentation, temperature exposure tests, chemical injections, psychological conditioning protocols. Each entry was signed with initials he didn't recognize, except for one that appeared repeatedly, G.H. George Hartwell, his grandfather. The realization hit him like shrapnel to the chest. His war hero grandfather, the man whose Purple Heart sat in a place of honor above the cabin's fireplace, had been involved in something monstrous. Marcus fumbled through more folders, desperate to find evidence that would exonerate the man who had taught him to fish, to hunt, to be strong in the face of adversity. Instead, he found more damning evidence. Progress reports detailing the effects of various compounds on human subjects, budgetary documents outlining funding from something called Operation Nightfall. Most chilling of all, a letter bearing his grandfather's full signature, recommending the expansion of testing to include younger subjects for enhanced baseline measurements. Marcus's vision blurred. He thought of the bedtime stories his grandfather had told him about serving his country with honor, about the sacrifices made to protect freedom. Had it all been lies? Had the man who'd shaped his understanding of duty and patriotism been complicit in atrocities that made his own wartime experiences seem pale by comparison? A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. He quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into absolute darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he listened, straining to determine if the approaching presence was real or just his traumatized mind playing tricks. The footsteps stopped directly outside the cabin. Marcus felt his way to the filing cabinet and quietly gathered as many documents as he could carry. Whatever was happening, whoever was out there, he needed to get these files to safety. The evidence was too important to risk losing, even if it destroyed everything he'd believed about his family. A knock echoed through the cabin. 3 measured raps on the front door. "Marcus Hartwell?" The voice was male, authoritative, with the crisp diction of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My name is Agent Caldwell with the Department of Veterans Affairs. I understand you've recently inherited this property." The lie was smooth, practiced, but Marcus had heard enough lies from government officials to recognize the cadence. No VA agent would show up unannounced at a remote cabin after dark. He pressed himself against the hidden room's wall, documents clutched against his chest, and tried to control his breathing. "Mr. Hartwell, I know you're here. Your truck is in the driveway. I'd like to discuss some paperwork regarding your grandfather's military service. There are certain discrepancies that need to be resolved." The front door creaked open. Marcus's blood turned to ice. He'd locked that door. Whoever this was had come prepared with tools, which meant this wasn't a casual visit. They knew what he'd found, or at least suspected it. Footsteps moved through the main room, measured and searching. A flashlight beam swept past the hidden room's entrance, the light seeping through hairline cracks around the concealed door. Marcus held his breath, acutely aware of every sound, his pulse, the rustle of papers against his jacket, the subtle whisper of his breathing. "Interesting collection your grandfather kept," the voice called out, closer now. Old military man, wasn't he? Sometimes veterans hold on to things they shouldn't. Classified materials have a way of finding their way into private hands during wartime. Usually innocent mistakes, of course. The beam of light lingered on the bookshelf that concealed the entrance. Marcus watched in terror as fingers probed the edges, searching for the mechanism he'd discovered earlier. "The thing about classified materials, Mr. Hartwell, is that they belong to the government. Regardless of how long they've been missing, regardless of who's been keeping them safe, some secrets are too dangerous for civilian hands." The hidden door began to swing open, and Marcus realized his war was far from over. It was just beginning, and this time, the enemy wore a familiar flag. The photographs scattered across the metal table like fallen leaves, each one a fragment of a nightmare Marcus wished he could unsee. His grandfather's handwriting filled the margins of yellow documents, notes that grew increasingly frantic as the dates progressed through 1953. The overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across classified stamps and redacted paragraphs, creating a chiaroscuro of government secrets. Marcus picked up a photograph showing children lined up outside what appeared to be a school. Their faces were blank, expressions eerily vacant. Someone had written Subject Group A, Day 14 across the bottom in clinical block letters. His stomach churned as he noticed the ages couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. A manila folder labeled Project Mindbridge contained the thickest collection of documents. As Marcus flipped through pages of psychological assessments and medical records, a pattern emerged that made his hands shake. The children weren't students, they were test subjects. The school was a front for something much darker. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the pages. They promised it would help the war effort. Stop communist infiltration. We were patriots doing our duty. But the doubt crept in through subsequent entries. The children aren't responding as predicted. Several have become catatonic. Dr. Brennan insists we continue. Marcus found himself reading about experimental drug cocktails, sensory deprivation chambers, and psychological conditioning techniques that belonged in a horror novel, not a government facility. His grandfather had been there, documented everything, been complicit in whatever fresh hell Project Mindbridge represented. The sound of gravel crunching outside froze Marcus mid-breath. His prosthetic leg bumped the table as he stood too quickly, sending photographs sliding toward the floor. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, nothing like the hurried pace of a lost hiker or concerned neighbor. Marcus grabbed the nearest document and stuffed it inside his jacket before switching off the light. The locked room plunged into absolute darkness, the kind that made you question whether your eyes were open or closed. He felt along the wall toward the door, his prosthetic leg creating small metallic sounds that seemed deafening in the silence. Through the main cabin, he could see a flashlight beam sweeping across the windows. Someone was circling the building, methodical and professional. Marcus's military training kicked in, muscle memory overriding the panic threatening to paralyze him. He needed to assess the threat, establish an exit strategy, and secure the evidence. The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. Marcus had locked it, but these didn't seem like people who would be deterred by residential security. He moved toward the kitchen, staying low, avoiding the windows. His satellite phone sat on the counter where he'd left it, but calling for help would take too long. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and whoever was outside had chosen their timing perfectly. A soft clicking sound from the back door made Marcus's blood run cold. Lockpicks, professional tools wielded by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He had maybe 30 seconds before they gained entry. Marcus grabbed a kitchen knife and positioned himself behind the refrigerator where he could see both entrances. The documents in the locked room represented decades of secrets, but they wouldn't matter if he didn't survive the night. His grandfather had kept this hidden for 70 years. Someone powerful enough to track Marcus to this remote location clearly wanted it to stay buried. The back door opened with barely a whisper. Two figures entered, moving with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. They wore dark clothing and carried suppressed weapons, their movements creating no sound on the wooden floors. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows, gripping the knife handle until his knuckles went white. The intruders split up immediately. One headed toward the living room, while the other began searching the kitchen. Marcus could hear them communicating through subtle hand signals, their training evident in every gesture. These weren't random criminals or government bureaucrats playing spy games. They were professionals sent to clean up a very specific problem. Marcus held his breath as the kitchen searcher moved past his hiding spot, close enough that he could smell gun oil and aftershave. The man opened cabinets and drawers with practiced efficiency, looking for something particular. When he reached for the drawer containing Marcus's grandfather's journal, Marcus knew his hiding time was over. The soldier in Marcus took control. He struck from behind, driving the knife toward the man's neck while simultaneously grabbing for his weapon. But his prosthetic leg betrayed him, creating a sound that alerted the second intruder. The kitchen erupted in violence as Marcus fought for his life, knowing that somewhere in this cabin lay evidence of crimes that powerful people would kill to protect. The truth about Project Mindbridge was worth dying for, but Marcus intended to make sure he lived long enough to expose it. The floorboards groaned under Marcus's weight as he paced the cabin's main room, his prosthetic leg clicking against the worn wood with each turn. 3 days had passed since he'd discovered the locked room, and sleep had become a stranger. Every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. Every sound beyond the walls made him reach for the .45 he now kept within arm's reach. The documents spread across his grandfather's desk told a story that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his family. Project Nightfall wasn't just some Cold War experiment. It was a systematic program to test biological weapons on unwitting American citizens, rural communities, indigenous reservations, military bases. The list of target locations ran for pages, each entry signed off by officials whose names Marcus recognized from history books. But it was the final batch of papers that had shattered his world completely. A subsection labeled Operational Assets contained recruitment records for civilians who would help facilitate the tests, local doctors, government employees, trusted community members who could provide access and maintain cover. The signature at the bottom of one particular contract made his hands shake every time he looked at it. Thomas Holloway. His grandfather's name, written in the same careful script Marcus remembered from birthday cards and Christmas letters. The old man hadn't just known about the experiments, he'd helped orchestrate them. Marcus grabbed his laptop and searched for more details about the Millbrook incident mentioned in several files. What he found made his stomach churn. 43 people had died in that small Montana town in 1962, officially from a contaminated water supply. The real cause, according to the documents, was an aerosolized pathogen released during a field test of biological dispersal methods. Children had been among the casualties. His grandfather had been there. The deployment orders proved it. A soft thud from the roof made Marcus freeze. He'd grown accustomed to the cabin's normal sounds, settling wood, scurrying mice, whined through the eaves. This was different, deliberate. He reached for his pistol and moved toward the window, staying low. Nothing visible in the dying afternoon light. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of shadows and hiding places. Marcus cursed his grandfather for choosing such an isolated location. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, far enough that screams wouldn't carry. Another sound, this time from the back of the cabin. Footsteps on the small porch. Marcus's military training kicked in, muscle memory overriding fear. He moved through the rooms with practiced silence, checking angles and sightlines. The locked room's door stood slightly ajar. Had he left it that way? The back door's handle turned slowly. Marcus positioned himself behind the kitchen counter, weapon trained on the entrance. The door swung open with a prolonged creak, but nobody entered. Wind rustled the trees outside, carrying the scent of rain and pine needles. "I know you're in there, Marcus." The voice was unfamiliar, gravelly and tired. An older man by the sound of it. "We need to talk. I'm not here to hurt you." Marcus kept his gun raised but didn't respond. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that talking could get you killed faster than silence. "Your grandfather saved my life once. I owe him that much." Still nothing. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "I'm going to step inside now. Hands visible. Don't shoot an old fool who drove 6 hours to warn you." A figure appeared in the doorway, tall and gaunt, wearing a worn canvas jacket. His hands were indeed visible, empty and raised slightly. Deep lines carved his weathered face, and his eyes held the particular weariness Marcus recognized in fellow veterans. "You found the room," the stranger said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" "Name's Robert Chen. I worked with your grandfather during the Nightfall years. We've been watching the cabin ever since he died, waiting to see if anyone would discover what he kept hidden." Marcus didn't lower his weapon. "We? The few of us left who know the truth, who've spent the last 60 years trying to keep it buried." Chen stepped fully inside, moving slowly. "Your grandfather wasn't the monster those files make him out to be, son. He was trying to stop it. The documents say otherwise." Chen nodded grimly. They would. Tom was deep undercover, gathering evidence for people who could expose the whole program. Problem was, Nightfall had tentacles everywhere. When he finally found someone he could trust in Congress, that someone ended up dead in a car accident 3 days later. Convenient story. Look at the dates on those deployment orders. Cross-reference them with the incident reports. Your grandfather was documenting everything, building a case. He wasn't facilitating those tests, he was trying to prevent them. Marcus's arms were beginning to ache from holding the pistol steady. Even if that's true, why keep it secret all these years? Chen's expression darkened. Because the people who ran Nightfall never went away. They just found new positions, new ways to operate, and they've killed to protect this secret before. The sound of gravel crunching under tires sent Marcus scrambling to the window. Through the frost-covered glass, he watched a black SUV roll to a stop beside his truck. 2 figures emerged, a tall man in a dark coat and a woman with silver hair pulled back severely. They moved with the measured precision of people accustomed to authority. Marcus grabbed his crutches and made his way to the front door, his mind racing. The documents were still spread across the kitchen table, damning evidence laid bare for anyone to see. He'd been so absorbed in piecing together the puzzle that he'd forgotten to watch for visitors. The woman knocked first, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. "Mr. Torres?" Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen with the Department of Defense. This is Agent Morrison. We'd like to speak with you about your grandfather's property." Marcus opened the door just wide enough to see their faces clearly. Both held identification badges, and Chen's eyes were already scanning what she could see of the cabin's interior. "What about it?" Marcus kept his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "May we come in? It's rather cold out here, and this is a conversation best had privately." Marcus hesitated. Every instinct told him to slam the door and bar it shut, but running would only confirm their suspicions. Instead, he stepped back and allowed them entry, noting how Morrison's hand rested casually near his jacket, close to where a shoulder holster would sit. Chen's gaze swept the living room with professional thoroughness before settling on Marcus. "We understand you've been going through your grandfather's belongings. Found anything interesting?" "Old fishing gear, mostly. Some photographs." Marcus shifted his weight, using his crutches to subtly position himself between the agents and the kitchen doorway. "Why? What's this about?" Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. "Your grandfather worked on some classified projects during the Cold War. Standard protocol requires us to secure any materials that might compromise national security." "Classified projects?" Marcus let confusion color his voice. He was a mechanic. Chen and Morrison exchanged a look that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Marcus caught it, filing the detail away. "Yes, well, mechanics often worked on classified equipment," Chen said smoothly. "Routine stuff, really, but we need to make sure nothing sensitive ends up in the wrong hands. You understand?" Through the kitchen doorway, Marcus could see the corner of the blackwood file peeking out from under other papers. One more step to the right, and Chen would spot it too. "I haven't found anything like that," Marcus said. "But you're welcome to look around if it helps. I've got coffee on. Can I offer you some?" It was a calculated risk, but it got Chen moving in the wrong direction, toward the living room instead of the kitchen. Morrison remained by the door, watching. "That's kind of you, but we're pressed for time," Chen said, though her eyes continued cataloging every detail of the cabin's interior. "Tell me, have you accessed any locked rooms or storage areas?" The question hit like a physical blow, but Marcus kept his expression neutral. "There was a root cellar that was padlocked shut. Took me a while to get it open." "And what did you find?" "Canned goods from the Carter administration and a family of very angry raccoons." Marcus managed a rueful smile. "Grandfather always was paranoid about running out of food." Chen's laugh sounded forced. "Yes, his generation went through some difficult times. Made them cautious." She paused, studying Marcus's face. "Mr. Torres, I hope you understand that some secrets are kept for good reasons. Your grandfather was a patriot who understood that certain knowledge could be dangerous in civilian hands." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus nodded slowly. "Of course. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I know about operational security. Then you'll understand why we need your cooperation." Morrison stepped forward slightly. "If you do happen to find anything that seems unusual, you'll contact us immediately." Chen produced a business card from her coat pocket. The cardstock was expensive, but the contact information was minimal, just a name and phone number. "We'll be in the area for the next few days, wrapping up some loose ends," she said. "Don't hesitate to call if you need anything, or if anything comes to mind." Marcus accepted the card, noting how Chen's fingers lingered on his for just a moment. Her grip was firm, her skin cold from the winter air. "I appreciate you stopping by to explain things," Marcus said. "I'll be sure to call if I find anything." The agents moved toward the door with the same measured precision they displayed upon arrival. Morrison paused at the threshold. "Nice and quiet out here," he observed. "Isolated. Easy for accidents to happen. when people aren't careful. Then they were gone, leaving only the scent of expensive cologne and the lingering weight of unspoken threats hanging in the air like smoke. The manila folders scattered across the cabin's main table told a story Marcus wished he'd never begun to read. 3 sleepless nights had passed since he'd broken into his grandfather's hidden room, and each document revealed another layer of betrayal that cut deeper than shrapnel ever could. His prosthetic leg ached from the damp mountain air as he shifted in the wooden chair, studying a photograph that made his stomach clench. The black and white image showed his grandfather, 20 years younger, standing beside a man in a military uniform outside what looked like a research facility. The caption, typed on official letterhead, read, "Project Blackwood, Phase 2 Implementation, Dr. Heinrich Volkov and Technical Liaison William Hayes." Marcus set the photo down with trembling fingers. Hayes, his grandfather's real name, buried beneath decades of carefully constructed lies. The man who'd taught him to fish, who'd sat beside his hospital bed after the IED explosion, who'd spoken so proudly of Marcus's service to his country, that man had been someone else entirely. The wind rattled the cabin windows as Marcus reached for another file. This one contained medical records, dozens of them, all bearing the same facility stamp. Names, ages, conditions, all redacted with thick black ink except for the final column marked status. Every single entry ended the same way, deceased. A sudden creak from the front porch made Marcus freeze. He'd disabled the security system 3 days ago, too paranoid to trust any electronic device that might give away his location. Now he regretted that decision as he strained to listen through the storm brewing outside. Another creak, definitely footsteps. Marcus grabbed his service pistol from the table and clicked off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. His military training kicked in despite the tremor in his hands. He'd survived Afghanistan. He could survive whatever was coming for him now. The front door handle turned slowly, almost silently. Professional work. Marcus positioned himself behind the stone fireplace, his prosthetic making balance tricky on the uneven wooden floor. Through the darkness, he watched a shadow slip through the doorway, tall, lean, moving with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to violence. "I know you're in here, Mr. Cole." The voice was calm, almost conversational. "My name is Agent Morrison, NSA. I think we need to talk." Funny way of starting a conversation, Marcus called back, keeping his weapon trained on the shadow, breaking into someone's home. Morrison stepped into a shaft of moonlight filtering through the window. Middle-aged, wearing a dark suit despite the remote location, he held his hands visible but relaxed. "Your grandfather's home, technically, and given what you've discovered, I'd say normal protocols are no longer applicable. You killed him." It wasn't a question. Marcus had found the autopsy report buried in the files. Heart attack, but with traces of an untraceable compound that wouldn't show up in standard toxicology. William Hayes was a patriot who understood the weight of keeping certain secrets. Unfortunately, he developed a conscience in his final years, started making inquiries about contacting you. Morrison's tone remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. We couldn't allow that. Marcus shifted his position, testing Morrison's reflexes. The agent tracked the movement but didn't reach for a weapon. "So what now? You kill me too?" "That depends entirely on your next decision." Morrison gestured toward the table covered in documents. "You've seen what Project Blackwood accomplished. Yes, it was morally questionable by today's standards, but those experiments, those sacrifices, led to medical breakthroughs that saved thousands of American lives. Your life, actually." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? The prosthetic technology that got you walking again? The anti-rejection drugs that prevented your body from fighting the implants? All derived from Blackwood research. Your grandfather specifically requested that you receive the most advanced treatment available." Morrison's smile was cold in the moonlight. "He wanted to save you, Mr. Cole, just like he helped save countless others." Marcus felt the weight of the revelation settling on his shoulders like lead armor. Every step he'd taken on his artificial leg, every day he'd lived independently instead of wheelchair-bound, all of it built on the graves of unwilling test subjects. You're lying. Check file 17. Your medical records are there, along with the treatment protocols. Every injection, every procedure cross-referenced with Blackwood data. Morrison took a careful step closer. Your grandfather made a deal with us decades ago. His silence for access to technology that would help wounded veterans like yourself. He kept that bargain until the day he died. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows. Marcus's grip on his weapon wavered as the full scope of his situation became clear. He wasn't just holding evidence of a government conspiracy, he was living proof of it, walking around on legs made possible by unspeakable crimes. Morrison seemed to sense his uncertainty. So the question becomes, Mr. Cole, are you willing to destroy the very system that gave you back your life? The dead drop coordinates led Marcus through a maze of overgrown hiking trails that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. His prosthetic caught on fallen branches twice, forcing him to stop and readjust the mechanism while scanning the tree line for movement. Every shadow could hide a sniper, every rustling branch might signal an ambush. The GPS coordinates from his grandfather's notes pointed to a location 3 miles northeast of the cabin, deep in protected forest land where few hikers ventured. Marcus had memorized the route before destroying the paper, knowing that carrying physical evidence made him a liability to everyone involved. After 2 hours of difficult terrain, he found it. A massive oak tree with a distinctive lightning scar running down its trunk, exactly as described in the coded journal entries. At its base, partially concealed by decades of leaf litter and undergrowth, sat a rusted metal ammunition box wrapped in deteriorating canvas. Marcus's hands trembled as he cleared away the debris. The box was heavier than expected, and the lock had long since corroded away. Inside, sealed in multiple layers of plastic, lay documents that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about Project North Star. The first file contained photographs of test subjects, soldiers who'd volunteered for what they believed were routine medical evaluations. Marcus recognized some faces from his grandfather's war memorabilia, men who'd served alongside him in Korea. According to the documentation, these soldiers had been administered experimental compounds designed to enhance combat performance and pain tolerance. The results were horrific. Detailed medical reports described subjects who'd developed severe psychological disorders, others who'd suffered organ failure, and some who'd simply vanished from military records entirely. The project had used American servicemen as unwitting guinea pigs, testing chemical cocktails that would later be refined for use against enemy populations. But it was the final document that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. A memorandum dated 3 months before his grandfather's supposed death bore the official seal of the Central Intelligence Agency. The subject line read, Asset Elimination Protocol, Operation Family Tree. The memo detailed a systematic plan to eliminate all surviving test subjects and their immediate families. His grandfather's name appeared on a list of 37 targets, each marked with a red stamp indicating priority termination. The document explained that surviving subjects posed an unacceptable security risk, as many had begun experiencing delayed psychological effects that made them unstable and prone to disclosure. Marcus read the words again, certain he'd misunderstood. His grandfather hadn't died in a hunting accident. He'd been murdered by the same government he'd faithfully served, killed to protect a secret that had already destroyed dozens of other families. The sound of approaching vehicles shattered his concentration. Through the trees, Marcus could see black SUVs navigating the narrow Forest Service road, their occupants undoubtedly armed and prepared for violence. They'd been tracking him, probably through the cell phone he'd foolishly carried despite his paranoia. Moving as quickly as his prosthetic allowed, Marcus stuffed the documents inside his jacket and began working his way deeper into the forest. Behind him, car doors slammed and voices echoed through the trees, professional, coordinated, deadly serious. Target is mobile. Heading northwest from the drop site, a voice called out. Remember, we need him alive until we recover all materials. Marcus knew these woods better than his pursuers, having spent weeks exploring during his rehabilitation. There was an old hunting blind about half a mile ahead, built into a cluster of boulders that would provide both concealment and defensive position. If he could reach it before they closed the gap, he might have options. His prosthetic began malfunctioning as he pushed through increasingly rough terrain, the servos whining in protest against the uneven ground and accumulated debris. Each step became more labored, more uncertain. The voices behind him were getting closer. Just as his strength began to fail, Marcus spotted the hunting blind's camouflaged roof through the underbrush. He half ran, half stumbled toward it, diving inside just as the first searcher appeared in the clearing behind him. From his concealed position, Marcus could see 3 teams of 2 operators each, all wearing tactical gear and carrying military-grade weapons. They moved with practiced efficiency, communicating through hand signals as they established a search perimeter. These weren't FBI agents or local law enforcement, they were private contractors, the kind of people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The team leader spoke into his radio. Containment established. Target is trapped in grid 7, moving to flush and capture. Marcus checked his phone and found exactly what he'd expected. No signal. They were jamming communications, ensuring he couldn't transmit the document's contents even if he'd been prepared to do so. Whatever happened in these woods would remain secret, just like his grandfather's real death had remained secret for 30 years. As the tactical teams began their systematic approach toward his position, Marcus realized he had perhaps 10 minutes before they'd overrun his hiding spot. 10 minutes to decide whether to surrender and hope for mercy or make a stand that would almost certainly end in his death. The documents pressed against his chest felt heavier than any burden he'd carried, even in combat. The floorboards groaned under Marcus's weight as he paced the cabin's main room, his prosthetic leg clicking against the wooden planks with each turn. 3 days had passed since his escape from the burning warehouse, and the silence felt more ominous than any gunfire he'd faced overseas. Outside, storm clouds gathered like a bruise across the mountain sky. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, spreading out copies of the documents they'd salvaged. Her laptop screen cast a pale glow across her concentrated features as she cross-referenced names and dates. "I've found 12 more test subjects," she said without looking up. "All military personnel. All reported missing or killed in action between 1952 and 1967. Marcus stopped pacing and gripped the back of a chair. The wood creaked under his fingers. "My grandfather's name is on half those reports. How could he have been involved in something like this?" "Maybe he wasn't." Sarah's voice carried a note of hope that sounded forced. "Some of these documents suggest internal resistance. Look at this." She pointed to a memo dated March 15, 1963. The letterhead read Project Mindbridge, Internal Security. Marcus leaned closer, catching the scent of Sarah's shampoo mixed with the cabin's perpetual mustiness. "Subject 47 has been relocated due to security concerns," Marcus read aloud. "Operative Henderson continues to express reservations about protocol compliance. Recommend immediate reassignment or termination of clearance." Henderson, that was my grandfather's last name before he changed it. The implications hung between them like a loaded gun. Marcus straightened, his back protesting after hours bent over documents. Through the window he watched pine trees sway in the strengthening wind. The forest that had once felt like sanctuary now seemed to press against the cabin's walls with malevolent intent. Sarah's phone buzzed against the table. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "Unknown number," she whispered, but answered anyway. Marcus heard only one side of the conversation, but that was enough. Sarah's responses came in clipped monosyllables. "Yes, I understand. 24 hours. When she ended the call, her hands were shaking. "They have my sister," she said. "They want all the documents, including the originals, tomorrow night at the old mining facility 20 miles north of here." Marcus felt the familiar weight of tactical decision-making settle over his shoulders. It was the same feeling he'd carried through 3 tours of duty, the knowledge that choices made in the next few minutes would determine who lived and who died. "We call the FBI," he said, "or the media. Both. With what proof? These documents could be fabricated, even if they believed us. How long before someone in the government suppresses the investigation?" Sarah stood abruptly, knocking over her coffee mug. The dark liquid spread across the table, seeping into the edges of the papers. "I can't lose another family member to this thing." Marcus watched her frantically dab at the spilled coffee with paper towels. Her movements were jerky, desperate. He recognized the signs of someone operating on pure adrenaline and fading hope. "There's another option," he said quietly. She looked up, towels still clutched in her hands. Outside, the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. "We give them what they want," Marcus continued, "but not how they expect it." He moved to the fireplace where his grandfather's hunting rifle hung on wooden pegs. The weapon was old but well-maintained, its stock worn smooth by decades of use. Next to it sat a smaller case containing his service pistol, a weight he'd carried through more firefights than he cared to remember. "You're talking about an ambush," Sarah said. "I'm talking about evening the odds." Marcus lifted the rifle down, checking its action with practiced efficiency. "These people have been operating in shadows for 70 years. They're used to intimidating civilians, not dealing with someone who knows how to fight back." Thunder rumbled across the mountains and the cabin lights flickered. In the uncertain illumination, Marcus saw something shift in Sarah's expression, fear giving way to grim determination. "What do you need me to do?" Before Marcus could answer, the lights died completely. Emergency battery backup kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through the rain-streaked windows, he caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, not the random motion of wildlife, but the purposeful advance of trained operatives. "They're here," he whispered, chambering around. "Forget 24 hours. They're not waiting." Sarah grabbed her laptop and the document case, stuffing both into a waterproof backpack. "Back exit?" Marcus shook his head. The red emergency lighting made his face look like a war mask. "Too late for running. We make our stand here." The sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch echoed through the room like a death knell. The floorboards groaned under Marcus's weight as he descended into the basement, his prosthetic leg making each step deliberate and measured. The photograph clutched in his trembling hand showed his grandfather standing beside 3 other men in military uniforms, their faces young and unmarked by the horrors they would later orchestrate. The date scrawled on the back read Project Nightfall, 1953. His grandfather's journal lay open on the workbench where he'd left it, the leather binding cracked and yellowed with age. Marcus had been avoiding it since finding the photograph hidden behind the loose baseboard, but the approaching headlights he'd spotted through the kitchen window left him no choice. Someone was coming, and he needed answers before they arrived. The basement felt different now, oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with the low ceiling or musty air. Every shadow seemed to harbor secrets, every corner a potential hiding place for more damning evidence. Marcus positioned himself where he could see the stairs while he read, his grandfather's pistol within easy reach. The journal entries painted a picture of methodical horror disguised as patriotic duty. His grandfather, Colonel Robert Hayes, had been part of a classified program testing experimental drugs on unwitting subjects. The victims weren't foreign enemies or volunteers. They were American citizens, homeless veterans, psychiatric patients, anyone society had already forgotten. Day 47. Subject 23 shows severe neurological deterioration. Dr. Brennan insists we continue despite obvious suffering. The compound affects the amygdala in ways we didn't anticipate. Fear response becomes so acute that subjects experience cardiac arrest from their own terror. Marcus's hands shook as he turned the page. Outside, the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the thin cabin walls. Multiple vehicles, multiple people. His pulse quickened, the familiar surge of combat adrenaline flooding his system despite his body's limitations. Day 62, lost another one today. Make 17 total casualties. Brennan says it's acceptable losses for the greater good. I'm beginning to question what good we're actually serving. These people trusted us. The basement door creaked open above him. Marcus quietly closed the journal and slipped it inside his jacket, then gripped the pistol. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess threats, find cover, control the situation. The workbench would provide minimal protection, but it was better than standing exposed in the center of the room. Footsteps crossed the floor overhead, deliberate and searching. At least 3 distinct gates, possibly more. Marcus recognized the sound of a systematic search. They were professionals, not random intruders. His grandfather's past had finally caught up with both of them. "Check every room," a woman's voice commanded. "He's here somewhere. The car's still warm." Marcus had heard that voice before. Agent Sarah Chen from the supposed EPA investigation. Her cover had been expertly crafted, but reading his grandfather's journal had opened his eyes to how deep this conspiracy ran. The EPA was just another government agency that could be compromised or manipulated when necessary. A flashlight beam swept down the basement stairs, probing the darkness. Marcus pressed himself against the workbench, grateful for the shadows cast by hanging tools and old furniture. His prosthetic leg had gone numb from the cold concrete floor, but he couldn't risk shifting position. "Sir, we found something," another voice called from upstairs. Male, younger, nervous. "There's a hidden panel behind the bookshelf. Looks like it's been recently disturbed." The footsteps converged on the living room directly above Marcus's hiding spot. He could hear them moving furniture, their voices muffled but urgent. They'd discovered the room where he'd found the photographs and documents, but hopefully not everything. The most incriminating evidence was either with him or already uploaded to the secure server he'd set up as insurance. "Damn it," Chen's voice carried clearly through the floorboards. "Half the files are missing." "He's been busy." Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. His grandfather had taught him to always have an exit strategy, though the old man probably never imagined his lessons would be used against his own legacy. The backup plans Marcus had set in motion would ensure the truth survived even if he didn't. The basement door opened fully, and footsteps began descending the stairs. Marcus tightened his grip on the pistol, knowing he was outgunned but refusing to go down without a fight. His grandfather's sins weren't his to bear, but the choice of how this story ended was entirely his own. The flashlight beam swept closer, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts in the stale air. Marcus thought of the victims described in the journal, people who had trusted the government to protect them, only to become disposable test subjects. Their fear in those final moments must have been overwhelming, trapped and helpless as their own terror consumed them. But Marcus wasn't helpless. He was a soldier, trained and experienced, with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The beam of light crept closer to his position, and he prepared to make his grandfather's final secret worth dying for. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like blades through silk, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus pressed himself against the cabin wall, his prosthetic leg aching from the sudden movement. Through the kitchen window, he watched the black aircraft circle once before settling into the clearing where Sarah's car had been parked just hours earlier. 3 men in dark suits emerged, their movements precise and coordinated. Marcus recognized the type immediately. Government operatives, probably CIA or some other alphabet agency's grandfather had warned him about in those final fever-addled days before his death. One of them spoke into a radio while the other 2 began approaching the cabin, their hands resting casually on concealed weapons. Marcus's mind raced. The documents were still spread across his grandfather's desk in the locked room, damning evidence of Project Nightfall that these men would kill to retrieve. Sarah had taken photographs with her phone before leaving, but the originals remained here, and destroying them felt like betraying every soldier who had died because of the conspiracy. The front door rattled under a firm knock. Mr. Briggs? We're with the Department of Veterans Affairs. We understand you've been experiencing some difficulties adjusting to civilian life." The lie was smooth, practiced. Marcus almost admired their audacity. He grabbed his grandfather's service pistol from the kitchen drawer, checking the clip with hands that barely trembled, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 6 rounds, against 3 trained operatives with military-grade equipment. "Just a moment," Marcus called out, affecting a sleepy voice. "Let me get decent." He limped quickly to the locked room, gathering the most crucial documents, the ones detailing the chemical weapons tests on American soldiers, the cover-up report signed by generals whose names still graced military bases across the country. The manila envelope crinkled as he stuffed them inside his jacket. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Mr. Briggs, please open the door. We're here to help." Marcus moved to the back of the cabin, where his grandfather had installed what looked like a decorative wooden panel, a hidden exit, revealed only in the old man's final letter. The panel slid aside to reveal a narrow passage leading into the woods, probably dug during the Cold War when paranoia was a survival skill. Behind him, the front door splintered. Marcus crawled into the passage, his prosthetic legs scraping against the earthen walls. The tunnel was longer than he'd expected, emerging behind a cluster of pine trees 50 yards from the cabin. He could hear voices shouting inside, efficient and angry. "Tear it apart. Find everything. Sir, there's a room back here. Looks like it's been accessed recently." Marcus forced himself to move faster, using trees for support as his damaged leg threatened to buckle. The documents pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat, heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. His grandfather had carried this burden alone for 40 years. Now it was his turn. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah made it to Denver. Files uploading to secure server. Whatever happens, the truth gets out. Relief flooded through him. Even if they caught him, the story would survive. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. The sound of pursuit crashed through the underbrush behind him. They'd found the tunnel exit. Marcus pushed deeper into the forest, following a deer path his grandfather had shown him years ago. The old man's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes retreat isn't surrender, boy. Sometimes it's just changing the battlefield." A gunshot cracked through the trees, bark exploding inches from Marcus's head. They weren't planning to take him alive. Another shot, closer this time. His leg gave out, sending him tumbling down a steep embankment into a creek bed. Cold water soaked through his clothes as he rolled behind a fallen log. Above him, voices called out coordinates, organizing a systematic search. Professional, methodical, deadly. Marcus pulled out his phone, fingers numb as he typed a message to Sarah, uploaded everything to cloud backup. Password is Rachel's birthday. If something happens to me, make sure her brother knows the truth about why she really died. The footsteps were getting closer. Marcus checked his grandfather's pistol one last time, thinking about Rachel, about all the soldiers who died not knowing they'd been betrayed by their own government, about Sarah driving toward Denver with evidence that could topple careers and rewrite history books. He wasn't a hero. Heroes didn't shake when they held guns, didn't feel their hearts hammering against their ribs like caged birds. Heroes probably didn't think about their dead wives in moments like this, wondering if courage was just fear with better press coverage. But as the first operative appeared through the trees, Marcus steadied his aim and remembered something else his grandfather had told him. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody ever hears about. The forest held its breath, waiting for the next shot to echo through the morning air. The explosion rattled every window in the cabin and sent Marcus diving behind his grandfather's old desk. Wood splinters rained down from the ceiling as a second blast echoed through the forest, closer this time. Through the smoke drifting past the windows, he could see the orange glow of flames consuming his truck. "So much for leaving quietly," he muttered, clutching the metal briefcase containing copies of all the documents. His prosthetic leg throbbed where he'd landed awkwardly, but there was no time to adjust it properly. Heavy boots crunched on gravel outside. Multiple sets. Marcus counted at least 3 distinct footfall patterns as they approached the front porch. He'd learned to distinguish such details during his tours overseas, skills he'd hoped never to need again on American soil. A voice called out, authoritative and cold. "Mr. Chen, we know you're in there. We also know what you've found. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." Marcus recognized the voice from their earlier phone conversation. Agent Harrison, though Marcus doubted that was his real name. The man's tone carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to cleaning up messes that officially never existed. "Funny way of showing it," Marcus shouted back, gesturing at the burning wreckage of his vehicle. Was the fireworks display really necessary? That was a precaution, to ensure you'd listen carefully to what we have to say. Marcus crawled toward the back of the cabin, staying low beneath the window line. The locked room where this nightmare had begun felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a week since he'd first pried open that hidden door. Now, the carefully organized evidence was scattered across his grandfather's living room. Photographs, classified documents, witness testimonies that painted a horrific picture of human experimentation spanning decades. The worst part wasn't the government conspiracy itself. He'd seen enough military cover-ups to know how deep institutional rot could spread. What gutted him was his grandfather's signature on half the authorization forms. The man who'd taught him to fish, who'd bandaged his childhood scrapes, who'd visited him in the hospital after the IED blast. That same man had signed off on injecting unwitting subjects with experimental compounds. "Your grandfather was a patriot, Mr. Chen," Harrison continued, as if reading his thoughts. "He understood that freedom requires sacrifice, sometimes from people who never volunteered to make it." "Is that supposed to make it better?" Marcus called back, while quietly opening the rear window. The forest behind the cabin was thick enough to provide cover, if he could reach it. "It's supposed to provide context. The Cold War demanded difficult choices. Every government made them. The difference is that most countries were less meticulous about documenting their decisions." Marcus swung his good leg over the windowsill, then carefully maneuvered his prosthetic through. The metal briefcase caught briefly on the frame, and for a terrifying moment he thought it might fall and alert them to his escape route. "What your grandfather preserved in that room," Harrison's voice carried clearly in the mountain air, "was never meant as evidence of wrongdoing. It was insurance. Proof that if other nations ever accused America of crossing certain lines, we could demonstrate that our research served defensive purposes." The explanation might have been more convincing if Marcus hadn't found the photographs of test subjects, homeless veterans from the 1970s, mental patients, prisoners who'd been told they were receiving standard medical care. Their faces haunted him more than anything he'd witnessed overseas, because these people had trusted the very system that betrayed them. Marcus moved through the trees as quietly as his prosthetic would allow. Each step required careful placement to avoid snapping twigs or rustling through dry leaves. His physical therapy had focused on mobility, not stealth, but muscle memory from his military training gradually returned. Behind him, he heard glass breaking as the agents forced entry into the cabin. They'd discover his escape route within minutes, but the forest extended for miles in every direction. If he could reach the old logging road that ran along the ridge, he might find help. The briefcase felt heavier with each step, weighted not just with documents but with the knowledge of what exposing them would mean. His grandfather's reputation would be destroyed posthumously. The families of victims would learn horrible truths about loved ones who'd suffered and died. Government officials who'd had nothing to do with the original crimes would face consequences for institutional cover-ups. But those same officials were now trying to kill him to protect secrets that weren't even theirs to keep. A branch cracked somewhere behind him, closer than expected. They'd found his trail faster than anticipated. Marcus quickened his pace, ignoring the burning sensation where his prosthetic rubbed against the socket. The ridge was still half a mile away through increasingly dense undergrowth. His grandfather had made his choice decades ago, prioritizing national security over individual lives. Now Marcus faced his own impossible decision. carrying evidence that could expose the truth or bury it forever. Either way, he had to survive long enough to make that choice matter. The photographs scattered across the cabin floor like fallen leaves, each one a fragment of a nightmare Marcus had never imagined. His grandfather's face stared back at him from dozens of black and white images, young, uniformed, standing beside men in lab coats, while figures in hospital gowns writhed in restraints behind them. Marcus's prosthetic leg ached as he knelt among the evidence, his hands trembling as he picked up document after document. Project Mindbreak, unauthorized human experimentation, names, dates, locations, all bearing his grandfather's signature as supervising officer. The sound of gravel crunching outside made him freeze. A car door slammed, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. Marcus grabbed as many documents as he could carry and shoved them into his backpack, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Marcus Chen, this is Agent Harrison, FBI. I need to speak with you." The voice carried an authority that made Marcus's military training kick in automatically, but something felt wrong. Too convenient, too late at night. He'd learned to trust his instincts in Afghanistan, and they were screaming danger now. Moving as quietly as possible, Marcus made his way to the back of the cabin. Through the kitchen window, he glimpsed movement in the tree line, more than one person. This wasn't a friendly government visit. The front door splintered open just as Marcus slipped out the rear exit into the cold mountain air. Behind him, flashlight beams swept through the cabin's interior, accompanied by urgent voices. "Find those files, everything. We can't let this get out." Marcus limped into the forest, grateful for the moon's pale light filtering through the pine branches. His prosthetic wasn't designed for rough terrain, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Each step sent jolts of pain through his residual limb, but he'd endured worse. The voices behind him grew more agitated. "The room's been opened. Files are missing. How much did he take?" "Enough to bury us all." Marcus pressed deeper into the woods, following a deer trail he'd discovered during his weeks at the cabin. The backpack's weight pulled at his shoulders, but he couldn't abandon what he'd found. The evidence represented dozens of victims, people who'd suffered and died while his grandfather watched and documented. A branch snapped somewhere to his left. They were spreading out, trying to surround him. Marcus ducked behind a massive pine trunk, controlling his breathing the way he'd been taught in combat. The familiar routine helped calm his racing thoughts. His phone vibrated against his chest. A text from Sarah. "Marcus, where are you? Strange men were asking about you at the diner. I'm worried." Shit, they'd involved civilians. Marcus typed back quickly. "Stay away from the cabin. Don't trust anyone claiming to be federal agents. We'll explain later." Footsteps approached his hiding spot. Marcus held his breath as a figure passed within arm's reach, flashlight beam dancing across the forest floor. The man wore tactical gear but moved like someone more comfortable behind a desk than in the field. Not military, probably private contractors. Once the footsteps faded, Marcus continued his retreat. The pain in his leg was becoming unbearable, but he forced himself to maintain a steady pace. Somewhere ahead lay the old logging road where he'd hidden his truck 3 days ago, anticipating exactly this kind of situation. The sound of helicopters approaching made his blood run cold. They were escalating quickly, which meant the documents he carried were even more damaging than he'd realized. Marcus quickened his pace, despite the agony shooting through his prosthetic's connection point. A clearing opened ahead, moonlight revealing his truck exactly where he'd left it. As he approached the vehicle, movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from behind the passenger side, tall, familiar. "Hello, Marcus." Dr. Elizabeth Kane stepped into the light, no longer the friendly researcher who'd first contacted him about his grandfather's work. Her smile was cold, predatory. "You've been very difficult to track down," she said, raising her hands to show she was unarmed. "But I think we can reach an understanding. You're one of them." Marcus kept his distance, backpack clutched protectively. "The conspiracy. My grandfather's handlers. Your grandfather was a patriot who understood that sometimes terrible things must be done for the greater good. He helped develop techniques that saved American lives. by torturing innocent people, by advancing psychological warfare capabilities that ended conflicts before they began. Her voice remained calm, reasonable. The Cold War demanded sacrifices. Your grandfather made them willingly. Behind her, more figures emerged from the shadows. Marcus was surrounded, but they weren't moving to apprehend him yet. They wanted something. Give us the files, Marcus. Walk away from this. Live your life, knowing you served your country by protecting necessary secrets. Marcus thought of the photographs, the medical records, the testimony of survivors who tried for decades to expose what happened to them. His grandfather's signature on every authorization. And if I refuse? Dr. Kane's smile never wavered. Then you'll join your grandfather's legacy in ways you never imagined possible. The sound of Marcus's truck engine fading into the distance left an oppressive silence that seemed to press against Jake's eardrums. He stood in the cabin's doorway, watching the dust settle on the gravel road, knowing he had perhaps 6 hours before his brother returned with whoever he'd called. 6 hours to decide between family loyalty and the truth that burned in his chest like acid. The manila envelope containing the photographs felt impossibly heavy in his hands as he limped back inside. Each step sent jolts of pain through his damaged leg, but it was nothing compared to the ache spreading through his chest. Everything he'd believed about his grandfather, about his family's honor, about the war they'd all served, it was crumbling like old plaster. Jake spread the photographs across the kitchen table again, forcing himself to look at them with fresh eyes. The images were undeniably clear. His grandfather in an SS uniform, standing beside what could only be a mass grave. Other photos showed him at what appeared to be a medical facility, observing procedures being performed on clearly unwilling subjects. The dates on the backs of the photographs were in his grandfather's own handwriting. Jake recognized the careful script from birthday cards and Christmas notes. Operation Paperclip. He'd heard whispers of it during his military service, fragments of conversations between intelligence officers who thought enlisted men weren't listening. The government program that had secretly brought Nazi scientists to America after the war, giving them new identities and careers in exchange for their knowledge. War criminals transformed into American heroes. His phone buzzed against the table. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment Jake considered not answering. How could he explain any of this to her? How could he tell the woman he loved that his entire family legacy was built on a foundation of blood and lies? Jake? Her voice was tight with concern. I've been trying to reach you. Where are you? At the cabin. The words felt like gravel in his throat. Sarah, I need to tell you something. Are you all right? You sound terrible. He closed his eyes, Marcus's words echoing in his mind. Think about what this would do to Mom, to all of us. His mother, who kept his grandfather's purple heart on the mantelpiece like a shrine. His nephew, who wrote school reports about his war hero great-grandfather. The entire community that had named a street after Heinrich Miller, the brave German-American who'd helped win the war against fascism. I found something, Jake said finally, in the locked room. Evidence of something my grandfather was involved in during the war. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Jake wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. What kind of evidence? The kind that could destroy everything my family believes about itself. He picked up one of the photographs, studying his grandfather's face. Even in the grainy black and white image, Heinrich's expression was calm, almost bored, as he observed atrocities that should have horrified any decent person. The kind that proves everything we thought we knew was a lie. Jake, you're scaring me. What exactly did you find? Before he could answer, he heard the sound of an engine approaching. His blood turned to ice. Marcus couldn't be back already. Jake moved to the window, staying low, and peered through the curtain. A black SUV with government plates was pulling into the clearing. I have to go, he whispered into the phone. Jake, don't hang up. He ended the call and quickly gathered the photographs, his hands shaking as he stuffed them back into the envelope. The SUV's doors slammed shut, and through the window He could see two figures in dark suits approaching the cabin. They moved with the controlled precision of federal agents, and Jake realized with growing horror that someone had been monitoring the situation all along. His grandfather's journal lay open on the table, and Jake quickly flipped through it, looking for anything that might explain who these people were. On the last page, he found what he was looking for, a list of names and phone numbers, with notes beside each one. Emergency contacts, the header read. If the truth ever surfaces. The network was still active. After all these decades, someone was still protecting Operation Paperclip's secrets, still cleaning up loose ends. Jake thought about the accident that had killed the previous owner of the cabin, the man who'd tried to sell it to a historical society. How many others had stumbled across the truth only to disappear? A firm knock echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Miller? FBI. We'd like to speak with you." Jake looked at the envelope in his hands, then at his grandfather's journal, then at the door that stood between him and two federal agents who might very well be there to ensure his silence permanently. The decision he'd been agonizing over was about to be made for him. He limped toward the back of the cabin, toward the root cellar where this nightmare had begun. The documents scattered across the cabin floor told a story Marcus wished he'd never uncovered. His grandfather's meticulous handwriting filled margins with notes that painted a picture of systematic cover-ups, illegal experiments, and deaths that were never meant to be investigated. The MK Ultra program hadn't ended in the 70s, it had evolved, gone deeper underground, and his grandfather had been its unwilling guardian of secrets. Marcus's prosthetic leg ached as he shifted position, sorting through photographs that made his stomach turn. Children in hospital beds, adults strapped to chairs with electrodes attached to their temples, test subjects who looked disturbingly like missing persons from decades past. Each image bore his grandfather's stamp on the back, evidence collected, catalogued, and hidden away in this remote sanctuary. The sound of an engine cutting through the mountain silence made his blood freeze. Headlights swept across the cabin windows, moving slowly, deliberately. Marcus killed the lantern and crawled toward the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A black SUV had pulled up beside his truck, and three figures emerged, their movements coordinated and professional. He recognized the woman from the hospital, Agent Sarah Chen, though he doubted that was her real name. The two men with her moved like military, their hands resting casually near concealed weapons. They weren't here to negotiate. Marcus gathered the most damning documents, stuffing them into a waterproof bag along with the flash drives he'd found hidden in his grandfather's typewriter. The locked room had contained more than just files. It held backup drives, recorded testimonies, and a detailed map marking locations across the country where the experiments had taken place. The cabin's front door exploded inward with a splintering crash. Marcus was already moving toward the back exit, his military training overriding the panic that threatened to paralyze him. He'd prepared for this possibility, mapping escape routes and hiding places during his first week at the cabin. "Marcus Thompson." Chen's voice carried through the darkness. "We know you're here. We're not your enemies. We just want to talk." He almost laughed at the absurdity. They'd blown his door off its hinges to have a conversation. Marcus slipped out the rear window, landing hard on his good leg and rolling to absorb the impact. The prosthetic sent sharp pain up his thigh, but he pushed through it, moving toward the tree line. Behind him, flashlight beams swept through the cabin's interior. He heard Chen curse as she discovered the empty locked room, its contents now in Marcus's possession. The urgency in her voice told him everything he needed to know about how badly they wanted this information buried. The forest offered cover, but Marcus knew it wouldn't last long. These people had resources, thermal imaging, tracking equipment, and probably backup teams already mobilizing. He had maybe an hour's head start before they'd have the entire mountain surrounded. His grandfather had planned for this too. Hidden among the documents was a hand-drawn map leading to an old mining tunnel half a mile north. A cache of supplies waited there, along with a radio and emergency contacts who might help him get the evidence to the right people. if such people still existed. Marcus pushed through the undergrowth, following landmarks his grandfather had described in his notes. The old man had spent decades preparing for the day when his secrets would surface, when someone would finally connect the dots between the missing funding, the unexplained deaths, and the facilities that officially didn't exist. The mining tunnel entrance was exactly where the map indicated, concealed behind a rockfall that looked natural but had been carefully constructed. Marcus squeezed through the gap, his flashlight revealing a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. Emergency supplies lined one wall, food, water, medical kit, and a shortwave radio that crackled to life when he powered it up. The encrypted frequency his grandfather had specified remained active. When Marcus transmitted the code phrase from the documents, a voice responded within minutes. Professional, cautious, but interested enough to arrange a meeting. Someone in Washington still cared about the truth, even if they had to operate in shadows. As he prepared to leave the cache, Marcus heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Chen's team was bringing in serious resources. Whatever his grandfather had discovered, whatever evidence these documents contained, it was worth killing for and worth dying to protect. Marcus sealed the waterproof bag inside his jacket and headed deeper into the tunnel system. According to the maps, these passages connected to an old logging road on the mountain's eastern slope. If he could reach his motorcycle, hidden there 3 days ago when paranoia had finally overtaken him, he might make it to the rendezvous point. The weight of decades-old secrets pressed down on him as he navigated the darkness. His grandfather had carried this burden alone, protecting information that could topple careers and expose atrocities committed in the name of national security. Now that responsibility belonged to Marcus, and he intended to see it through to the end. The flames licked higher around the cabin's frame as Marcus stepped back, watching decades of secrets turn to ash. The locked room was already consumed, its files and photographs feeding the hungry fire that would erase any trace of Project Nightfall. His grandfather's betrayal, the murdered families, the government's darkest experiments, all of it would die here in the mountains where it began. Sarah stood beside him, her face illuminated by the orange glow. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus nodded, though his chest felt hollow. "Some truths are too dangerous to survive." The distant rumble of helicopters grew louder. Through the trees, searchlights swept across the mountainside like mechanical vultures hunting for carrion. Agent Morrison's people were closing in, but they were too late. The evidence was already becoming smoke and memory. "We need to move," Sarah said, shouldering her pack. "They'll be here in minutes." Marcus took one last look at the burning cabin. Somewhere in those flames were the answers he'd spent weeks seeking, the truth about his family's past that had nearly gotten him killed. But some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He'd learned that lesson in Afghanistan, and he was learning it again now. They moved through the forest with practiced stealth, Marcus's military training overriding the ache in his injured leg. The escape route he'd planned led down the mountain's eastern face, away from the access roads where Morrison's teams would be staging their assault. Behind them, the fire roared higher, consuming not just the cabin, but any hope of recovering what lay hidden in its walls. The helicopters passed overhead, their rotors beating like mechanical hearts. Spotlights carved through the darkness, searching for movement among the trees. Marcus pressed himself against a massive pine, feeling the rough bark through his jacket. Beside him, Sarah's breathing was steady and controlled. Whatever else she wasn't afraid. A branch snapped somewhere to their left. Marcus froze, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his waist. Through the undergrowth, he caught a glimpse of tactical gear and night vision goggles. Morrison's men were already on the ground, moving through the forest in coordinated sweeps. Sarah touched his arm and pointed toward a rocky outcropping 50 yards downhill. They moved together, silent as shadows, while the search teams continued their methodical advance. The fire behind them had become a beacon, drawing the hunters like moths while their prey slipped away into the darkness. They reached the rocks as voices echoed through the trees above them. Marcus recognized Morrison's clipped tones issuing orders to his men. The agent sounded frustrated, which meant he'd already realized what the fire meant. 30 years of careful secrecy reduced to smoke and ash. "Sir, we've found the room," a voice crackled over radio static. "It's completely destroyed. Nothing salvageable." "Keep searching," Morrison replied. "They're still out here somewhere." Marcus and Sarah continued their descent, moving from cover to cover as the search expanded around them. Every few minutes, helicopters would circle back, their lights probing the forest canopy. But the terrain worked in their favor, steep slopes and dense timber that made aerial surveillance nearly impossible. An hour later, they reached the old logging road where Marcus had hidden his truck 3 days earlier. The vehicle sat undisturbed beneath a camouflage tarp, its keys still taped under the rear bumper. As they drove away from the mountain, Marcus watched the glow of the fire fade in his rearview mirror. "What now?" Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question as they wound through darkened valleys. He thought about the families mentioned in those burned files, people who'd lost everything to project Nightfall's experiments. Their stories would never be told now, their suffering never acknowledged. But telling those stories would have meant destroying innocent lives in the present. People like his grandfather's surviving colleagues, men who'd been following orders in a different time. "Now we disappear," he said finally. "Find somewhere quiet and try to forget what we learned up there." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Can you do that? Really forget?" Marcus flexed his fingers on the steering wheel. His grandfather had carried these secrets for 60 years, had died without ever revealing what he'd done. Maybe that was the right choice after all. Some truths were too heavy for the world to bear. "I have to," he said. They drove through the night, leaving the mountains and their secrets behind. In the eastern sky, dawn was beginning to break, painting the horizon in shades of hope and possibility. Marcus thought about the future, his pension, the insurance money from the cabin, the chance to start over somewhere new, clean slate, fresh beginning. Behind them, the last wisps of smoke rose from the mountain, carrying the ghosts of Project Nightfall into the morning air, where they finally, mercifully began to fade.